Welcome to another episode of the Schiller Hamilton podcast. Today I'm joined by none other than Derek Harper.
Glad to be here, man.
Derek, thanks for joining us, man.
Of course.
Came all the way from the big city of Lancaster.
The big city, the Red Rose City.
The Red Rose City. We'll get into that. I want to hear all about why it's called that, but we'll get into that. Anyway, thanks for coming up. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do for Schiller and Hamilton?
Of course, yes. So I manage our Lancaster office, which is in downtown Lancaster, South Carolina. We service the entire Lancaster County, as well as some communities surrounding the area, such as Kershaw, which is actually in Lancaster County and not Kershaw County, as well as Pageland and Chesterfield County and some of Kershaw County, and then also some of the areas in Chester County, like Fort Lawn and things like that are just as close to Lancaster. We're just there to be there for wherever people may be and be convenient for them.
Yeah. What kind of cases do you take there?
So everything that we do in the firm, which would be all plaintiffs' work, including personal injury from car accidents, from wrongful death, slip and fall or premises liability accidents, workers' compensation, Social Security and disability, and we also do a few ancillary practices such as probate and family law on a case-by-case basis.
So you have a bit of a unique position with the firm, though, because you actually grew up in Lancaster.
I did, yes.
So what's it like practicing law where you grew up?
I love it.
Especially a small town like Lancaster.
Yeah.
I would imagine is really cool.
I do love it. I get to work with some people that I knew growing up. I'd get to serve a community that I have a fondness for. Growing up there, obviously, you always have a connection to where you're from. And I definitely have that connection. Lancaster has been through a lot of struggles over the years, and I love being able to give a little bit back to the community within my career.
So there's a difference between being from a place and then being from a place.
Yes.
I think you would qualify as the latter. Why don't you talk a little bit about your roots and your family's roots in Lancaster?
Sure, yes. So my family immigrated from Northern Ireland to Lancaster County, which was then, I don't think, Lancaster County actually, in 1767. And we've had roots there ever since. In fact, not very many people up until my generation moved out of Lancaster County or set down roots everywhere else. My direct family has been there for quite a long time.
So you're what, 6, 7 generations? Somewhere around there? Have you ever done the math?
It may be, 7 or 8 maybe.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yep.
And I believe you still have some family property there that goes back that far, right?
We do. We have a family farm that was my grandfather's on the southern part of the county in a community called Elgin. And part of that land has been owned by no one but Harper's since the King's Grant, which would have been in the 1780s.
That goes back a long way.
It does. So we really have roots in Lancaster County for as long as Lancaster County's been around.
How has Lancaster changed since you were there for school or when you were growing up?
Well, earlier in my growing up years, Springs industry would have still been very well, very going still before they moved a lot of jobs out of the country and out of Lancaster County. At one point, I'm sure we all know, a lot of people know around here that Springs Industries was one of the largest textile companies in the country, and it was headquartered in Lancaster. And a lot of people grew up for decades, almost 100 years of they would just go to high school, graduate, and work for Springs. A lot of people in my family work for Springs. And when those textile jobs left, just like a lot of small communities in South Carolina, it left a large hole in the employment workforce. And so that really has caused a lot of strain. And then more recently, a lot of other industries have left the town. And so it's just kind of had its ups and downs. It was featured about 15, 20 years ago by CNN as a very, I'm not going to say a bad town, but a very vulnerable town, which caused a very strong reaction from Lancaster citizens. In fact, that was when the We Are Lancaster kind of hashtag, I guess it was a hashtag, or motto.
Pre-hashtag.
Yeah, it may have been pre-hashtag, but that was when the motto kind of came out, and a lot of businesses rallied together. And it's all too easy for a business to leave an area like that. And so when I came on with the firm and had the opportunity to help reopen our office in Lancaster, I jumped at the opportunity.
What does it mean to you to be able to serve a community that you grew up in?
It means everything. The reason that I went into law, to be honest, was in order to work with the public. I was a business major in college and was on the track to go and work in a business environment, whether that be marketing or some sort of corporate position, and decided as I was going through college to choose a path that I could serve the public with. And law kind of opened the door for that, and I really enjoy serving the people in Lancaster any way I can through my career.
So in addition to your work with Schiller and Hamilton, what other work do you do to help out in the community?
So I'm involved with an organization some people may have heard of called Ducks Unlimited, and Ducks Unlimited is a nonprofit organization that raises money to conserve wetland habitat. Now, that obviously was created and is primarily for the benefit of waterfowl, but also just benefits a lot of different species of animals, birds, and really and truthfully, it's just a land organization. So they are conserving and protecting land throughout North America, and my part in that is I am a volunteer with our local chapter. So I am the chairman of a committee of volunteers that puts on an event every year, as well as other projects to get the name out there and spread the word and to raise money for that cause. I also have been involved with the chamber for a while and did a Leadership Lancaster course through them to try to just understand the different needs and goals of Lancaster County going forward as a business, either owner or business person in the county. So
I think there are very few firms that actually serve Lancaster County that have a tangible presence in Lancaster County with an office there. And our office is right downtown,
yes.
which I think is really cool. And you're right by the courthouse. One thing that's always really impressed me about Lancaster is that it has one of the original Robert Mills courthouses.
It does.
Have you been over there since famously, the courthouse actually was burned down due to an arsonist several years ago. It was about 10 years ago now, probably.
2009.
2009. Have you been over there lately? What's
I have.
going on with the new courthouse?
So when they rebuilt it, they turned it into an event space. They built a new state-of-the-art courthouse, which is one of the best, probably the nicest in the state, or at least it was when it was built. And they turned the old historic courthouse into an event space, which is really neat. They rebuilt a replica of the bench but spruced it up a little bit so it could be used for events, parties, things like that. But the really cool part is in the basement, or the first level, the ground level, which used to be offices, clerk of court, things like that, is a museum, which is really neat. It's got some historic museum pieces from throughout the county, and it kind of highlights some of the historic, I guess, museum quality of the building itself. There's actually some graffiti on the walls from when the building was used as a jail during the Civil War, and they've highlighted those. And it's just a really neat way to save the building without having to have your court system in a 200-year-old building. It
is really cool to walk down through those halls and see the pencil drawings, the graffiti.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when we think of graffiti now, we might think of, spray paint or paint on the wall. These were pencil and charcoal drawings done on the wall by the prisoners just to really pass the time.
Just to pass the time.
And what's funny is the connection to the past, because those drawings are basically exactly what you think they would be. They're drawings of, someone's girlfriend maybe back home, or their name of their wife or their children or something.
Yep.
And it's just cool to see that human connection and how, in a lot of ways, things don't really change from one generation to another. Yeah. One thing I was hoping you would mention also in that museum is an item that I think belonged to someone in your family a long time ago.
Yes, there is a loom, textile loom that was from not a direct line of my family that actually donated it, but it would have been from my family. That's correct.
That's pretty cool. And it's not what you think of in a textile plant, like a fancy loom.
No, this would have been a hand loom.
This is a hand loom.
Yes. Yep.
But again, it kind of speaks to the textile heritage of the area, and I think that's pretty cool.
And I think the room that it's in is the textile or industry room that highlights some things from Lancaster's industry.
And, we kind of glossed right over the fact that it was a Robert Mills courthouse. Why is that significant?
Well, he was the first trained architect in America, and he designed so many buildings throughout, the early colonial and early United States of America, including some monuments in Washington. The Washington Monument. The Washington Monument he designed. I think they may have altered it a little bit from his initial design, but he definitely designed it. But he actually did a lot of courthouses throughout South Carolina. I don't know if he did.
Is he from South Carolina? Was it Charleston, maybe?
I'm honestly not sure. I think he might have been from Charleston.
Can we look that up, Trenton?
And I think he was trained by Thomas Jefferson.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Huh. That's an interesting.
Or they trained
connection.
together. Anyway, I'm not 100%. I'm not an expert on that matter, but.
So another thing I want to talk about that we kind of mentioned at the beginning, the Red Rose City.
Yes.
And then we famously have York down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Why York and Lancaster? What's the connection with the York and Lancaster in England?
So from what I understand is that York, Lancaster, and Chester counties, South Carolina, were named after the same counties roughly in the New England area. Pennsylvania has a Lancaster, a Chester, and a York County. I mean, there's a lot of counties and a lot of cities throughout the colonial states that have names from England. And obviously a lot of people have heard of the War of the Roses in England. And the two houses that were fighting in that war were the Lancaster House and the House of York. And their sigils were a red rose and a white rose. So I think just both cities decided to take that as their kind of sigil or design. Lancaster County being the red rose city, and then York being the white rose city.
That is pretty interesting. And recently, fast forwarding a bit, Lancaster is really one of the fastest growing counties in the state, which puts it in the running for being one of the fastest growing counties in the country. South Carolina is, famously outgrowing just about anywhere else. And especially very recently, we're getting even more folks wanting to move here. Where do you see Lancaster County in 5, 10, 20 years, and how can Lancaster maintain that connection to its past through that growth?
So you're correct. There's so much growth in the panhandle part of Lancaster, which would be closer to Charlotte and is definitely included in that Charlotte metropolitan area. And that development has kind of creeped down just further and further and further away from Charlotte. Some of the same benefits that York County is getting in Fort Mill, for example. Charlotte is just continuing to outgrow its borders. And, that's caused some strain, I'm sure, for some people in Lancaster County, on the county itself. Having a large bedroom community up there. However, I think going forward, the growth is not going to slow down. It's only going to trickle further south into what we call Lancaster proper, the city and the bulk of the county. But I think that the city and the county are going to have to balance that growth of a residential area with business and industry growth, because you can't have 200,000 people living in Lancaster County all commuting to Charlotte. There still has to be small business, there still has to be industry and things like that located within the county. And I think that's really going to be the tipping point really for Lancaster is, you can only grow so much as a bedroom community. And I think that if they start to invest in industry and growth and become a great candidate for a county for places to relocate, I think it's going to really explode Lancaster County.
Yeah, you mentioned the Panhandle area, the area known as Indian Land.
Yeah.
And for those people who may not know, Lancaster County is kind of shaped like a finger, or a hand with a finger. You have a square and then a panhandle jutting north. And that area is where a lot of the growth is currently coming. You mentioned coming down that 521 corridor and into the city where our offices are located. I have a question, though. So do you have a tendency to see, or do you think that there's a benefit for people that are in Lancaster to retain the services of an attorney who's from Lancaster and highly vested in that community?
Well, I think you just said it. I'm invested in the community. So many, you mentioned earlier too, that so many, especially in our industry of plaintiffs, law firms, have these little satellite offices throughout small towns throughout the state. They may have a major headquarters office in Columbia or Greenville or Charleston, but they will send out these little satellite offices to all sorts of types of little towns and communities. And they may be completely shuttered and only be an office room, or they may have a small staff or just one staff member or something like that. But when we say we have
or
an
a runner,
or a runner, you know, someone who literally
don't
watches,
even meet with the attorney.
Someone watches Netflix all day and just answers the door and the phones. But when we say we have an office in Lancaster, I staff it. It's me and our paralegal, Melissa, and we're there. and we're there if anyone needs us. If we're there, if you have to walk in, we're there if you call. And like you said, I am invested in the town because I'm from the town and I love the town. And, I love the people. I mean, the people who make Lancaster is really what makes it great. And so that's the point right there of having someone who's local, because that at some point they kind of relate to you in some way. And on another side too, you kind of know the area, you know the roads, the intersections, that, this intersection is dangerous. That turnaround on a divided highway is dangerous, or that a certain dip on number 9 going into Buford is a hot spot for accidents. Like, you just kind of know things like that, and you're kind of familiar with it. Whereas,
that can make a big difference with liability. If there's
really
a blind curve, or if there's a dip or a crest of a hill that you can't see over, that can really make a difference, especially when you have a case where someone may be pulling out from a stop sign, but you happen to know
exactly.
You can't see coming.
I'm not saying I know every little road and intersection in Lancaster County,
but it certainly helps.
A lot of them, you do realize, it's like, yeah, I know exactly where you're talking about. So,
yeah. One of the things that I think is really cool about the culture of Schiller and Hamilton is the way that not only are you from the community, you practice in the community, but we also go out of our way to be very intentional about giving back to the community.
Yeah.
What are some ways that through the firm we've given back to the community in Lancaster? Like, what festivals have we supported, or how do we try to make a difference there?
Well, last year we began being I guess you'd say, presenting kind of sponsor of the Red Rose Festival, which normally is held in May every year. Obviously, this year COVID changed everybody's plans, but we really love supporting those neighborhood events and community events, because they are such a critical part of a community, for a community to come together to, enjoy each other, celebrate each other. And, we love giving back. We do the same thing over here in Rock Hill, and I'm really glad that we can support things like that. And we also we've done, before, where we've had raffles for teachers and things like that. We try to do anything we can to give back to the community a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's cool. And we've also sponsored race cars in Lancaster.
That's
We've
right.
sponsored, kids soccer teams and baseball teams.
The world's fastest half-mile dirt track.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. I actually have never been to a race there, I have to confess.
Oh, you should definitely go.
Yeah, we need to make that happen.
I haven't been in a long time, but.
Is it BYOB, I believe?
I do believe.
I wonder, what are their COVID restrictions?
I
Are
don't
they
think
still operating?
I want to say they were operating this spring.
I would imagine they would be. It seems like they would just, it's
at least
outdoors. You can socially
least
distance properly, I'm sure.
I know at least they tried to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, another thing I thought it would be fun is to kind of go through some frequently asked questions that you and I get all the time in our personal injury practice.
Okay.
And I'm sure you probably get nearly every day, I'm sure, in Lancaster. So Trent, there they are. He's putting them up.
Okay.
So don't feel like you're on the spot, but we can kind of explain these and kind of riff on them a little bit.
Sounds good.
And kind of discuss what our perspective is. All right, so the first one, what's the difference between underinsured coverage and uninsured coverage? And this is a really good one for you in particular, because the Lancaster market is somewhat unique in that there's one hospital. I don't think it's any secret that the bills from that hospital tend to be relatively high, oftentimes exceeding what are minimum liability limits.
True.
And in Lancaster, there's probably a higher percentage of vehicles on the road with minimum liability limits. So this becomes relevant fairly often in Lancaster. Let's talk about this. What is the difference between underinsured coverage and uninsured coverage?
So it may appear like it is
because they look awfully similar.
Yeah, it may appear that they're very similar, but they're actually very different. So first of all, let's also talk about the shortened name for these, which is UM and UIM, which only makes it more confusing. So uninsured motorist coverage is going to cover you as the insured driver if someone else causes injury to you from an accident or to your property and is uninsured, meaning they do not have insurance, or in a hit-and-run situation. Okay, those cases, the uninsured, it's even hard for us to say, uninsured motorist coverage is going to pay for any injuries you may have and damage to your vehicle. It's also required by law in South Carolina. So in South Carolina, the liability limit, the minimum limits is $25,000 per accident, or $25,000 per person, $50,000 per occurrence. And so the UM requirement is the same. Okay. The underinsured motorist coverage is going to cover you if someone causes damage to you or injuries to you that exceed their limits. So let's just use your hypothetical. If someone is injured in an accident in Lancaster, goes to MUSC Lancaster, let's say has a $50,000 ER bill, and maybe continues to go on to treatment at a physical therapist or an orthopedic surgeon or anything like that. Let's just say they have $75,000 in damages. Well, the person who hit them had $25,000. So their limits of liability do not fully reimburse the injured party for their damages. So the underinsured coverage will be carried by the injured party on their insurance policy and would help cover some of those damages.
So, in other words, that person is underinsured for the loss that they've suffered. It never ceases to amaze me, though, how people either don't know that they do have underinsured coverage or think they have it and they don't.
Exactly.
What's unique about South Carolina is that it's not required for the motorist to carry, but it is required for the insurance agent to offer it to the motorist.
If you can call it that.
If you can call it that. But really, in practice, what that means is they sign a piece of paper that maybe was explained to them, maybe wasn't.
Yeah.
And they sign that piece of paper and they either reject the coverage or they purchase the coverage. Mm-hmm. And I think most people don't really understand what it is that they're rejecting or purchasing.
They really don't, because I feel like I'm not speaking for all insurance agents, but I feel a lot of them, people walk in and they say they want full coverage.
Or it's even worse. Most people buy their insurance online now.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
I'm one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get online and you buy your coverages. It's not like someone is sitting there explaining it to you. You either read it all or you don't. And most people, if they're buying it online, are probably trying to be efficient, so they may not read all of it. And we sort of take for granted that people understand what coverages there are out there. But in most cases, people just don't understand. But what's really cool is that if someone was not presented with the coverage, we can get that policy amended.
That's correct.
So if they have not signed a rejection of the coverage and the insurance company is not able to present it, we can then get the policy amended to include it.
In fact, that's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to you as well.
Definitely.
An insurance adjuster will tell us that it's not included, or it may not even be included on the declarations page.
Right.
And once we request the offer rejection, then we find out that it was not presented, or they can't find it in their file.
Right.
And so
we can amend it.
We can amend the policy.
And then magically, there's underinsured coverage.
Yeah. But I think, going back to why people don't necessarily have it, I think, you and I've talked about this before. It's like anything you do, you're upsold. If you buy a car, you're upsold to buy the higher trim packages. If you buy a piece of furniture or a television at Best Buy, you're going to be talked into buying the most expensive thing. And I think people kind of reject that. And I think
thinking that they're being upsold.
Thinking they're being upsold for something they don't need. And it couldn't be further from the truth.
Right. Everyone should have underinsured.
Everyone should have underinsured.
Especially because
coverage.
The cost of medical care has far outpaced the minimum liability limits.
Oh, by far.
Maybe whenever the $25,000 limit was first discussed and debated, maybe that was sufficient to cover most medical emergencies. But you really can't get in and out of an emergency room anymore for less than just the minimum liability coverage.
No.
And I don't see that changing anytime soon. But one thing you can control if you're a purchaser of insurance policies is to just purchase more underinsured coverage, especially if you have children, if you have a family.
Yep.
You really want to make sure everyone's adequately protected. Exactly. That's what it's for. Honestly, we could talk all day just about this one, but I think we have several more. So,
I do want to say one more thing about it. The other thing, too, is both of these coverages are portable in South Carolina, meaning they're going to follow you even if you weren't in the covered vehicle.
So if you're riding with someone else, I think it's
or if you're riding, in someone else's or another person's car or another car that you own or something like that. And they're also sometimes stackable, which we won't get too far into the weeds of that. But, you can sometimes stack these coverages to increase the amount of coverage you have for yourself in case you're in a catastrophic accident.
Yeah, and that's a game changer. That's where it really rears its head, is in catastrophic cases.
Yes.
Where there's hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of bills
and
$25,000 in covers.
Yep.
That's a very difficult conversation to have with anybody.
It is.
But it's made a little easier when there's another layer of coverage there. Ooh, should I talk to an insurance adjuster?
No.
Yeah, no. Next slide.
We can move on.
Yeah, no. Obviously, this can be a bad idea for a whole host of reasons, especially if it's a case where it's a possibility that liability can be contested.
Yeah.
And this gets especially problematic when those conversations are recorded.
It does. And, it's almost like the Miranda rights. It's not to the point of that, but they will kind of twist things that you say or misinterpret things or try to use it against you. But I think the other more critical thing that we're seeing is adjusters are trying to settle these cases with people and preclude their rights as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. We're seeing people get presented an offer and a release within 48 hours of an accident.
Oh, first conversation. Mm-hmm. Report case. Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, how about $1,000?
Yep.
And they haven't even been to the doctor yet. Or they'll say, well, we'll give you $1,000 right now, and we'll pay $5,000 or $10,000, whatever the number is, for future medical costs, as long as those medical costs are incurred within the first 3 months. And right after a wreck, that may sound somewhat reasonable, and oftentimes a lot of people have a need for immediate money. But $10,000 doesn't get you very far if you're injured and need any amount of treatment.
It really doesn't.
And how many times do we see where treatment takes way longer than 6 months? Someone has a nagging neck injury or a shoulder tear. That was one we were discussing earlier. Mm-hmm. A tear in their shoulder, they have a knee injury, and you have to schedule a surgery. You have to go have the surgery. You have to rehab the surgery. Well, that can take months, if not over a year, to get through an injury, let alone that's assuming that injury actually resolves back to 100%. Mm-hmm. There may be future medical costs associated with that injury. A conditional release is going to basically shut all that down right out of the gate. And oftentimes those are presented as a way for the insurance company to mitigate their downside and mitigate their cost, and kind of wrapped up in a package of convenience and speed when it's presented to the claimant. But unfortunately, a lot of times it just means the insurance company isn't going to have to pay what they actually owe.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of times those releases, the cap on medical damages are sometimes $5,000, $10,000. And we've already discussed that by the time you sign that, you don't know what your bill is at the hospital. Very rarely are you given a bill when you leave the hospital. And very rarely do people understand that if they went to the CT machine at Springs Memorial Hospital or MUSC Hospital in Lancaster, it may be $25,000. And so they don't know that. And so if you sign a release and cash your $1,000 check and release your case where they say they'll pay up to $5,000 in medical bills,
in a shocking amount of cases,
you have released your claim against that at-fault driver.
And it's horrible. But the good news is we have had instances where we've been able to get an insurance company to look past that conditional release and set it aside, because sometimes they're signed immediately after a wreck when the claimant is under duress. And we've been able to set those aside and open the policy back up. So even if someone has been involved in a situation like that, it doesn't hurt to talk to a lawyer and see if that's going to be the case.
You can it doesn't hurt to ever talk, because like you said, there may be some options that we have.
Yeah.
But this is why we tell people it's critical. It costs nothing to talk to us. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't walk into divorce court. You wouldn't walk into criminal court without having at least talked to a lawyer and explored your options and know what rights you have.
Exactly.
And so why would you do the same thing and deal with a multi-million-dollar company that does not have your best interests at heart and rely on them to tell you the truth? They're relying on a lot of these people being unsophisticated. And I'm not meaning that in a bad way. I'm just saying they're not sophisticated.
They're not accustomed to the process.
They're not accustomed to the process and the ins and outs of everything. And they're taking advantage of that any way they can.
Exactly. What else we got, Trent? How long will my case take?
Every day.
Yeah.
I get this question every day.
Yeah. And the classic answer is,
it depends.
It depends.
We really need, Trent, we really need a
it depends button.
And a button to do that.
Well, and we say it almost sounds like a joke, but that's the reality. No two cases are alike.
No.
And there are gates and barriers for every case to get through before you can get to the point where it even can resolve. And oftentimes what's driving that isn't necessarily the legal side, but the medical side.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if someone has a long-term injury that requires long-term medical care, surgeries, rehabilitation. It's our job to help define the damages that someone has suffered so that we know what the insurance company actually owes them. It can be impossible to do that sometimes without an adequate amount of time having passed so that we know how someone will plateau with their injury, where they reach what we call MMI, which is your maximum medical improvement. And we throw around these terms, but I like to try to explain them. that means when someone's gotten as good as they're going to get.
As good as they're going to get, yeah.
Yeah, if they've healed as much as they're going to, and that could be somewhere below 100%. Oftentimes it is. If you or I suffered a shoulder tear in a car wreck tomorrow, our shoulders would not get back to where they are right now. You would be somewhere below that 100%.
But you're to the point you've exhausted all the medical treatment.
Exactly, but you have to be able to define that, the percentage. And there's no way to do that without getting to that point. And so what a lot of people don't understand is it's actually the medical side that's driving that.
Yeah.
But why don't you talk a little bit about how the legal side could impact that as well?
Yeah, so like you said, it's going to depend on treatment. We're obviously not going to want to settle a case until you have completed treatment. So that could be anywhere from one visit to the emergency room to years. The other is going to be the delay in preparing the file to be sent to an insurance adjuster to try to get a settlement. That is going to involve not only discovery processes of getting information about the accident, whether that be police reports, any other evidence we may be able to accumulate, but also mainly the records and bills from your medical providers. We have to request those, and sometimes it takes months to get those. You know, they're not down in a storage unit or in a file cabinet at the hospital. You know, generally when we request them, they're coming from a document service and a record service, and it can take
basically
time.
You get in line. You send that request,
get
and
in
you
line.
get in line.
And unfortunately, a lot of times those requests are lost, misplaced, and we have to resend them. And so that's really the largest time drain that we have to explain to clients, is that we are sometimes at the mercy of the medical request departments or the medical record departments and billing departments to get those records to us. Because just like you said, we don't want to try to settle a case before you're through a treatment. Well, we also can't, we can't recommend that you accept a settlement based upon only part of your damages.
Exactly.
So we have to get all those in. But to answer this question, I usually tell people is obviously it does depend, but upon the completion of treatment, we're still looking at a couple months at the absolute minimum. Even once we accumulate everything and we send it off to an insurance company, again, you step into a line, and those adjusters have to review the file to make an offer, and that takes time as well. So,
and then we negotiate it because we want to get the most money as possible.
Exactly. And then there's obviously the black swan of litigation that happens every now and again. But if that happens, then we have to deal with a much longer time frame.
And we're not call it a black swan, but while it's a small percentage of the overall cases, it happens nearly every day. I think we put 3 cases into litigation just this week, but that's probably a very small percentage of our total cases.
Yes.
But it still happens fairly often. And then once a case goes into litigation, unfortunately, that process can take a year. But typically, if a case goes into litigation, it's because there's an issue either with causation or with liability, or the medical treatment is so significant that the insurance company is loath to pay the money, so they don't want to write the check. So they're going to they want to take a doctor's deposition, or they want to do something to try to mitigate what they're going to pay. So sometimes they'll just dig in their heels.
It does.
And sometimes, there's a significant issue of liability that needs to be resolved before anyone can resolve it. And it's either compromise, or if we're 100% certain that we can move forward and prove our side of the case, then there's not a reason to compromise. Let's go forward with litigation. So there's lots of reasons to do that. I do say it's a small percentage, but it does
is a
happen.
small percentage. Yeah. But, about this question, it does drastically change the timeline.
It does.
We always say the wheels of justice do move, but they move very slowly.
Yeah.
And, everything in the court system and litigation it's going to have time deadlines and things like that. So it does. It really does put it literally lengthens the case.
Yeah.
So,
how long will my case take? To what are my damages after an accident? Okay, this is interesting because it's hard to define it in terms of dollars, but it's easy to talk about it in terms of what types of damages are someone entitled to. Because we've mentioned every case can be different. One case, someone may be in pain for several years and only have $5,000 worth of medical treatment. Some cases, someone could have a $25,000 ER bill, but then never go back to the doctor, and they were totally fine the next day.
True.
So, and then everything in between. So saying 2 cases are alike, or being able to tell from day one what somebody is owed, is nearly impossible. So I like to talk about it in terms of just the scope of damages and give people an idea of the types of things that they're entitled to. And those are really divided into, economic and non-economic harm. Mm-hmm. The easy ones, of course, are the cost of medical treatment, your lost wages. The economic harm is basically your out-of-pocket costs, everything down to the mileage back and forth to the doctor's office. And we try to be as precise as we can with those because they're the most objective. Not that they're 100% objective, but they're the most objective. But where you really get into it being more of an art than a science really is where you start talking about things like pain and suffering, mental anguish, loss of enjoyment of life. Those can mean different things to different people. Mm-hmm. How do you explain that to your clients, and how do you present that to adjusters?
So it is a case-by-case basis, and you have to take into account the treatment itself. You can't argue $100,000 of pain and suffering for 2 weeks at the chiro.
I suppose you can, but not with much credibility.
Yeah, not very much credibility, and that's not what we're in the business of doing.
And let's say a little bit, it kind of comes down to what a jury would think is fair. And that's really what it comes down to.
That's the actual answer to the question.
You're right.
Is what would a jury of your peers think is fair to compensate you for the pain that you experienced physically and the suffering or the loss of enjoyment of life of going through the process, and then any other, other issues that you may have that are in that kind of spectral gray area and very subjective. But it's really a tough answer. Every case is so different, but basically the length of time, the treatment, the injuries to the person, the effect on their life outside of going to the doctor. Were you bound to a wheelchair, or were you in crutches for 3 months? Could you do everything that you normally like to do, your hobbies, playing with your kids? All of that kind of stuff goes into what the pain and suffering is.
This is where it really gets to be important to get to know your client, and why it's important for there to be a relationship between the attorney and the client, or for there to be some real conversation, or sit down with them at some point to discuss these things, because it is different for everybody. And for some people, a minor injury can have a drastic effect on their life, or what otherwise might be called a minor injury, if you just look at the medical records, could prevent them from being able to do their job, from picking up their children, to having to hire daycare, to not be able to clean their house and have to hire cleaning services, not be able to drive their vehicle and have to Uber everywhere.
Yep.
And to some degree, those almost become more objective. They're couched in terms of loss of enjoyment of life, but you can place a market value on it because you know what a cleaning service is worth. You know what a driving service is worth. So there are ways that you can place a market value on loss of enjoyment of life or pain and suffering. And so I think a useful tool is to try to distill those subjective things into objective economic terms as much as possible. But again, the only way to do that is to really talk to your client and figure out what it means.
Like you said, to discuss it and to constantly follow up with your client, see how they're doing. And it's things that insurance companies, you're right, having some sort of dollar amount or objective amount to something helps the insurance company adjusters so much better. They really do not like the term pain and suffering, and they assign arbitrary dollar figures to every injury.
They do.
And so, just trying to maximize that really is where we come into play. I mean, doing everything we can and investigating and seeking out any little thing that we can.
Like medical records, for instance, which oftentimes now have pain scales. And pain scales can be very helpful in determining the extent of pain as well as the duration of pain, because on visit 1, they may say this person was experiencing a 7. After 2 months of treatment, that may be down to a 5 or a 6 or whatever the case may be. But you can trace the graph of pain according to those pain scales, which actually becomes pretty helpful.
It does.
From showing, okay, well, month 1, they had X amount of pain. Month 2, they had this amount of pain. And if you can agree on what a severe amount of pain is, then you can kind of back into, okay, well, half of that would be worth this.
Yeah.
So there are useful ways to present it and some tools. But
you sit there and you say, okay, if you're in a constant state of 6 out of 10 pain, what would compensate you for living through that?
Yeah.
That's a way to think about it. And we everyone has their different taxes and everything. I really don't like actually assigning a dollar amount to the day, for example, like each day of treatment. But it's such a tough way to discuss it, and it's such a nebulous thing to kind of pick out of thin air, but that's what we have to try to do.
Yeah. And again, plaintiffs have the burden of proof.
Yep.
So it's on us to help prove how a wreck or how an injury affected somebody, and to prove the extent of their pain. And the more information we can gather, the better we will be at proving it. Mm-hmm. So it really comes down to studying the medical records, knowing your client, finding out how it affected them, finding out how it affected their performance at their job, and finding ways to create an economic tie to things that a lot of people might consider to be subjective.
Mm-hmm. So. And we have to compile and provide all that.
Yeah.
Because, when we're dealing with a pre-litigation settlement negotiations type case, mm-hmm. The only evidence is what we present to the insurance company.
And, one thing I like to do is make sure that people, after a wreck, and I think this is a great tip for anyone that has suffered an injury and is going through medical treatment, is to journal that journey for them. Describe the amount of pain that they're in, describe the things that they were unable to do that day due to their pain, to document the days where they may have suffered a migraine headache, for instance, or that their knee hurt so bad that they just couldn't get out of their chair, or their knee swelled so badly that they weren't able to do their job. And where that becomes really useful isn't necessarily in the context of a settlement negotiation, but if that case for some reason does go into litigation, it can be a year or more later when that person's deposition is taken, and at that point, we're asking them to recount those days.
And you have contemporaneous notes.
If you have contemporaneous notes, it's much easier for someone to either have those notes to help read or discuss it in a deposition, but if nothing else, to help jog their memory about what life was like during that time.
Well, it's the same we talk about when you get in an accident, to try to recall and record as much information as you can about what happened. Mm-hmm. And it's the same reason. And so that is a very useful tool. And I've actually had reviews over medical records with clients before we, are sending off a demand package to an insurance company, where we do that. We go through, even if it's not contemporaneous to the day you went to the hospital and the day you went to the doctor, to kind of go through week by week. And, how did you feel? What was your home treatment after you went to physical therapy? And, how was that? Was it easy? Was it, things like that. So that's a good question.
Yeah. What else we got? Oh, what if I am partially at fault for causing an accident?
That's a good question.
Yeah, this actually happens more often than people may think. And thankfully, we're in the state of South Carolina where it's somewhat okay. So in South Carolina, we have a modified comparative fault state where it's not straight comparative fault, it's modified up to 50%, meaning you can be up to 50% at fault for the wreck and still actually be entitled to the other amount of damages. So if you're 25% at fault, you can get 75% of your damages.
Reduces your recovery
by the amount of your fault.
By the amount of your fault up to 50%.
Which makes sense. If you're more than half at fault for the wreck, you probably shouldn't be able to recover due to your own negligence. But if the other person contributed to a greater degree, mm-hmm. there should be some award or some compensation for what you suffered.
But we're thankful we have it here in South Carolina.
Yeah, thankfully we have it here, because other states just across the line, North Carolina, they have 1%.
I believe there's 9.
And it's really, there's almost always an argument for 1%.
Oh, yeah.
Someone cuts in front of you, someone cuts across, you're driving down a divided 4-lane highway, somebody cuts across, you slam into the side of their car. A 1% argument would be, well,
you were speeding.
Or not even that you're speeding, that you could have braked in time and you just didn't.
Sure.
It's easy to make that argument, especially in retrospect.
And another thing I see a fair amount anyway, is that insurance adjusters try to abuse this to assign partial fault to the plaintiff in cases. In fact, I have a case that we're still in the process of settling. I can't get too much into it, obviously, but we have a case where someone pulled out in front from a driveway of a business and failed to yield right-of-way to our client. Well, the officer on the scene faulted both parties, presumably because our client said that she had her turn signal on. And she did have her turn signal on because she thought she was going to turn into somewhere, and then chose not to. But the at-fault driver still pulled out of the road into the roadway and caused our client to collide with their vehicle. And we're having to fight with the insurance company about that. South Carolina law is pretty clear on it. When you enter the roadway from a business or driveway or anything like that, you have to yield the way to all vehicles. And that's been expanded in court cases all the way to include cases.
Especially that specific case. You have a duty to make sure that person actually is turning and has cleared your line of entering the roadway prior to entering.
The South Carolina Supreme Court has expanded that to include vehicles you can't even see that are fully obstructed to your vision. But you're the last true cause of the accident because you had the last chance to not cause it.
Yeah.
And so it does raise its head a lot. And, it can adjust what a insurance company offers. It can adjust what a jury awards you. The problem is it's often wrong, whether that be on the report or from an insurance company. And we have to kind of do the investigation to figure it out. We've talked about the fact that green light, red light cases happen all the time. And unfortunately, sometimes that is a he said, she said, whatever you want to call it, until you get some third party witness, whether that be a video or a witness to the actual accident. And then we see it a lot with turning lanes. All too often when you have a four-lane road with a turning lane in the middle, who has the right of way to enter that turning lane? Yeah. And those kind of get really murky.
We have people abusing the turning lane and driving down the
through
turning lane.
Yep.
Try to cut to an intersection,
and
not
so
sit in traffic.
You really have to take a deep dive into those cases and do all of the investigating that you can so that you can figure out, what do we have here? What can we show? Is this truly 50-50 liability or 75-25 or whatever, because that's part of what we have to do.
Yeah. I think that's all of our questions.
Yeah. Those were good.
Yeah, those were fun. Derek, thanks for coming up.
No problem.
Thanks for making the trip into Rock Hill.
Not a problem at all.
Well, everyone else, I appreciate you listening to the Schiller and Hamilton podcast, and stay tuned to our next episode.